Fast Suit, it was a calm Tuesday morning on October 3, 1955, when the MV Joyita prepared to leave the shores of Apia Harbor in Samoa. The vessel, once a proud American Navy patrol boat built in 1931, had been repurposed into a commercial cargo ship, making routine trips between the islands of the South Pacific. On this particular day, she was scheduled to travel 270 miles northeast to the Tokelau Islands, a voyage that should have taken no more than 2 days. Aboard the Joyita were 25 individuals, 16 crew members and 9 passengers, including a well-respected doctor named Alfred Andy Parsons. The passengers ranged from a young child to experienced sailors, and cargo included barrels of oil, medical supplies, and empty drums for copra, dried coconut kernels. The boat itself, despite being old, was considered seaworthy. Though one engine was not functioning, the captain, Thomas H. Miller, assured everyone that the trip would be smooth. As the MV Joyita left port, no one suspected that they would be the last people to ever see her crew and passengers alive. By the time night fell, the Joyita had vanished into the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, and what followed would spark one of the most disturbing maritime mysteries of the 20th century. When Joyita failed to arrive at her destination, officials first assumed the trip had simply been delayed due to mechanical problems or bad weather. But as days passed, and then weeks, concern turned into panic. Planes were dispatched. Ships scanned hundreds of square miles of ocean. Radio silence made the situation even more ominous. No distress signals were received. It was as if the MV Joyita had been swallowed whole by the sea. What made this mystery especially haunting wasn't just that the ship disappeared. It was what was found 5 weeks later that continues to confound experts, sailors, and investigators to this day. A ghost ship, floating with no one aboard. On November 10, 1955, 37 days after she had vanished, the MV Joyita was spotted by a merchant vessel, Tuvalu, drifting more than 600 miles off course near the island of Vanuatu in Fiji. She was listing heavily to her port side, partially submerged but still afloat. It was an eerie sight, a ship without direction, crew, or any sign of life. When the crew of the Tuvalu boarded the Joyita, they were met with an unsettling scene. The ship was in poor condition, windows broken, barnacles clinging to her sides, and debris scattered across the deck. But the engines, surprisingly, remained intact. The radio was tuned to the international distress frequency. The lifeboats and life rafts were gone, and so were all 25 people who had been aboard. Inside, the signs of abandonment were chilling. A doctor's bag was found with blood-stained bandages, suggesting someone had been injured. The ship's logbook, navigation equipment, and much of the cargo were missing. Even the clocks on board had stopped at exactly 10:25, frozen in time. But perhaps the most baffling part of the discovery was that the MV Joyita had not sunk. Despite being partially flooded and tilted, she was still very much afloat, suggesting that her crew and passengers may have abandoned a vessel that could have still carried them to safety. This immediately raised questions. Why would experienced seamen and passengers desert a still-floating vessel in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? Why hadn't a distress signal gone out? And where were the lifeboats and rafts? As the Tuvalu towed the Joyita to shore, speculation spread like wildfire. Newspapers across the Pacific and even in Europe published headlines about the mystery. Theories ranged from the logical to the bizarre. Piracy, mutiny, a sudden storm, or even supernatural forces. The authorities began a formal investigation, but answers would be few. The ghost ship, though physically present, offered nothing but silence in return. The sea had given back the vessel, but not the truth. That would remain submerged. Captain Thomas H. Miller was no ordinary sailor. A seasoned mariner with decades of experience, he had captained the Joyita for many previous journeys. But in the weeks and months that followed her reappearance, questions began to swirl around Miller's judgment, character, and leadership on that fateful voyage. Born in the United States, Miller had served in various maritime roles before settling in the South Pacific. Described by colleagues as stern and private, he was also known to be stubborn. On the day of departure, several people had reportedly raised concerns about the Joyita's condition. One of the engines wasn't working. The ship was overloaded with cargo, and her hull was leaking, requiring near-constant pumping to keep water out. Yet Miller was adamant. He insisted the vessel was seaworthy and refused to delay the trip. The passengers, trusting his expertise, boarded anyway, but his confidence may have been misplaced. Some speculate that an emergency occurred not long after departure, perhaps a worsening leak, loss of navigation, or an onboard injury. If so, did Miller downplay the threat to avoid embarrassment? Or worse, did he make a fatal decision under pressure? The discovery of bloodied medical supplies suggested someone had been seriously hurt. Could it have been Miller himself? With the captain incapacitated, panic may have spread among the crew. Others believe a mutiny may have taken place. Was Miller overruled by desperate passengers or defiant sailors? Such theories are difficult to confirm, but they paint a picture of rising tension aboard the ship. The radio's wiring had also been tampered with, possibly preventing any distress call. Was that sabotage or just corrosion? Captain Miller was never found. Neither were his logbooks, notes, or personal effects. In maritime tradition, a captain is expected to go down with his ship, but the Joyita didn't sink. So where did he go? Did he try to save everyone? Or did he die trying? His past held no criminal record, but in the vacuum of answers, doubt settled in like fog. The man trusted to command the MV Joyita now shared in its mystery. One more ghost in a sea of unanswered questions. One of the most haunting aspects of the MV Joyita mystery is not just the disappearance of her crew, but the condition in which the ship was found. Despite being heavily damaged, she remained afloat, a stubborn survivor adrift in the Pacific. Maritime engineers later examined the ship and confirmed something remarkable. The Joyita was practically unsinkable. Her hull was made of solid wood, lined with cork, and her cargo hold was designed to remain buoyant even if partially flooded. She could have taken on tons of water and still stayed above sea level, so why abandon her? This fact deepens the mystery. The crew, especially experienced seamen like Captain Miller, would have known that the vessel was unlikely to sink. Leaving a damaged but still floating ship in the middle of the Pacific, without radio contact in shark-infested waters, makes no logical sense unless there was an overwhelming threat. Some have speculated that water began flooding the engine room, and in the absence of communication equipment, the crew feared that the ship might capsize. But even then, trained sailors would know to stay with the vessel. Statistically, abandoning a ship is almost always more dangerous than remaining on board, and yet they left. Adding to the strangeness was the fact that many valuable items were left behind: food, water, even navigational charts. The logbook and cargo manifest were missing, however, along with all life-saving equipment. The only way off the ship would have been via the missing life rafts and dinghies. But those were never found, neither washed ashore nor floating nearby. Not a single piece of wreckage from those smaller vessels was ever discovered. Had they been taken forcibly, or had the crew used them voluntarily in a miscalculated escape attempt? Moreover, the Joyita's position at the time of discovery was far off her planned course. Some theories suggest ocean currents could have carried her hundreds of miles over 5 weeks, but others believe she was deliberately redirected, perhaps hijacked, then abandoned. Yet if that were true, where were the hijackers? Where were the stolen goods? No ransom demands were made. No bodies ever recovered. The MV Joyita was found listing but alive, almost defiantly afloat. She had not sunk, she had not burned, and yet she had been emptied of life. A ship that refused to go down, returned, alone. And that made her even more terrifying. The MV Joyita did not return empty. She came back bearing silent, chilling evidence, fragments of a story that would never be told aloud. Among the most disturbing discoveries made on board was a doctor's bag. Inside it were surgical instruments, medications, and blood-soaked bandages. That bag belonged to Dr. Alfred Andy Parsons, one of the 9 passengers on the voyage. A seasoned medical officer and well known in the region, Dr. Parsons was expected in Tokelau to perform surgeries and provide urgently needed medical support. His presence on the ship gave an air of security to the other passengers, especially those who were sick or elderly. But the blood in his bag suggested that something serious had happened during the voyage, perhaps an injury, or even violence. The question was, whose blood was it? Was it Parsons himself? A wounded passenger, the captain? The absence of bodies meant no answers. The scene inside the ship offered little comfort. Cabins were in disarray. Supplies had been rifled through. One of the engines was covered in oil, and a pump had failed, allowing seawater to flood one side of the ship. The radio was discovered tuned to the emergency frequency, but it had been sabotaged. A critical wire had been cut. Whether this was due to corrosion, poor maintenance, or deliberate action is still debated. But the result was the same. The crew had no way to call for help. Even stranger was the discovery that the logbook, the captain's official record of events, was missing. So was the navigational equipment and the cargo manifest. Without these, investigators were left with nothing to reconstruct what happened during those lost 5 weeks. The ship's cargo had also been looted selectively. Some items were gone, others curiously left behind. If piracy had been the cause, why leave the valuable electronics? Why not take the engines or high-demand medical supplies? And then there was the clock. One wall-mounted marine chronometer, typically used for navigation, had stopped at exactly 10:25. It was impossible to say whether this indicated a time of power loss, a moment of crisis, or just mechanical failure. But it felt symbolic, like the ship had frozen in time. As investigators pieced through the Joyita's remains, the blood, the missing records, and the silence spoke volumes. The clues weren't leading to a solution. They were drawing a map into deeper mystery. A story had been lived here, a story of panic, maybe violence, maybe worse, but no one was left to tell it. The ocean had swallowed every witness. Of all the haunting details aboard the MV Joyita, perhaps the most crucial were the missing lifeboats and rafts. Every piece of evidence suggested that the passengers and crew had not simply vanished overboard, but had left the ship in some kind of organized evacuation. Yet the way they did so raised even more questions than it answered. When the Joyita was discovered, all 4 of her life rafts and the single dinghy were gone. These weren't small, fragile vessels. They were large enough to hold multiple people and should have left traces, debris, flotation residue, or even survivors, somewhere in the surrounding ocean. But no part of those lifeboats was ever recovered. Not a paddle, not a torn rope, not a scrap of canvas, nothing. The South Pacific is vast, yes, but it is not infinite, and after 5 weeks of international search operations, the lack of even one clue regarding those escape crafts became deeply suspicious. Did they truly attempt escape, or were they taken? Worse still, if the crew had abandoned the ship in panic, why was there no distress call? Even with the radio disabled, they had signal flares, emergency mirrors, and manual signal devices, all of which were found untouched. Some researchers believe the evacuation was the result of a false panic, a misjudgment by the crew. With one engine down, the bilge pump failing, and water flooding in, they might have feared the ship was sinking. But that fear would have to overpower logic. Remember, the MV Joyita was constructed with cork lining, a built-in safety design making her nearly impossible to sink. Veteran sailors would know this. Why would trained mariners and an experienced captain abandon such a vessel in favor of fragile rafts and open water? Unless they didn't have a choice. One theory suggests the crew was forced off the boat by pirates or unknown attackers. Under duress, they might have been taken onto separate boats or made to flee in life rafts under the threat of violence. But again, no signs of struggle, bullet holes, or blood trails were ever found outside the medical bag. Others believe something more internal occurred: mutiny, a breakdown in order, or a psychological crisis. Could fear itself have spread like wildfire through the ranks, leading to a desperate and illogical decision to abandon ship? In all possibilities, one terrifying truth remains consistent: 25 people got into lifeboats and were never seen again. No mayday, no survivors, no remains. They rode themselves into oblivion or into something far worse. When a mystery lingers long enough without explanation, theories start to fill the silence. The MV Joyita's vanishing gave birth to many, some grounded in reason, others drifting into the fantastical. But every theory shared one challenge: none could fully explain all the facts. Let's start with the piracy theory. The South Pacific, especially in the mid-20th century, was known for scattered cases of sea piracy, opportunistic attacks on lightly protected vessels. According to this view, pirates intercepted the Joyita, forced the crew off the ship, looted the most portable cargo and vanished, leaving the ship adrift. But if that happened, why wasn't all the cargo taken? Why leave behind medical supplies, equipment and food? And why not scuttle the ship to hide the crime? Ghost ships were attention magnets. Pirates don't usually leave evidence floating. Then there's the Japanese fishing fleet theory, popular among locals at the time. This idea suggests the Joyita may have stumbled upon illegal fishing activity or sensitive military operations by the Japanese just a decade after World War II. The crew might have been eliminated to keep the operations secret. But again, there was no physical evidence of violence, no bullet holes, no forced entries, and no witnesses. The mutiny theory raises the possibility of internal conflict. With Captain Miller reportedly acting stubborn, perhaps the crew lost confidence in him. Under pressure, engine failure, flooding, medical emergencies, the sailors could have overthrown the captain, attempted to evacuate and then succumbed to the harsh sea. Yet no one from the original 25 was ever found. No body. No voice to confirm rebellion. The medical emergency theory centers around Dr. Parsons. The presence of blood-stained bandages suggests someone was seriously injured. If that person was Parsons, or if he treated someone critical, the panic could have been compounded by illness or trauma. Perhaps there was a death on board. Did it trigger emotional breakdowns, irrational decisions? Still, it's hard to see how this alone would lead to full-scale abandonment. The most chilling theory of all is deliberate sabotage. The disabled radio, cut wiring, not just wear and tear, suggests someone didn't want a distress signal going out. That leans into darker possibilities. Hijacking, targeted removal, or psychological warfare. Did someone on board orchestrate a controlled disappearance? Or was there a greater external force ensuring the Joyita returned, but no one else did? These theories swirl like the currents that carried the vessel. Each has fragments of plausibility, but none can fully explain why 25 people vanished without a sound, leaving behind a ship still floating, still intact, and utterly alone. The sea has always been a graveyard of secrets, and the MV Joyita became one of its most whispered legends. After the initial investigation, the trail grew cold. No bodies ever washed ashore, no life rafts were found, no survivor ever stepped forward. The Pacific had swallowed 25 souls without a trace, and in the absence of answers, the silence itself became part of the mystery. Local fishermen in Samoa and Fiji began to speak of curses and omens. Some claimed to have seen ghostly lights flickering far out at sea in the nights following Joyita's disappearance. Others insisted the ship was marked by bad luck ever since she returned from military service. One chilling rumor claimed that anyone who tried to restore or reuse the Joyita afterward suffered strange fates: financial ruin, mental breakdowns, even death. Whether true or folklore, such stories fed the growing legend. But it wasn't just locals haunted by the event. Families of the victims received no closure, only government letters and fading headlines. The official inquest, held in early 1956, ruled the most likely cause of abandonment was human error, following engine failure and flooding. But it left most critical questions unanswered. Why no distress signal? Why was the ship still afloat weeks later? And why was no one ever recovered? In the decades that followed, the case remained officially unsolved. Attempts to reconstruct the route using ocean current simulations offered vague possibilities about where the life rafts may have drifted, but none led to conclusive findings. The South Pacific's vastness had swallowed everything: rafts, records, and reason. Modern historians and maritime experts occasionally revisit the case, citing Joyita as one of the strangest maritime disappearances not caused by natural disaster, war, or criminal attack. A case where every possible answer only deepens the mystery. Even today, satellite technology and sonar searches haven't uncovered any new evidence. It's as if the MV Joyita's crew were erased, their final moments buried beneath waves and time. The sea, ever indifferent, gave the ship back, but kept its passengers. That silence is what haunts people the most, not the horror of what might have happened, but the fact that we'll probably never know. Not because the clues don't exist, but because the ocean doesn't speak. The Joyita drifts in our minds now, more legend than vessel, a phantom echo of a journey that should have been routine, but became a haunting enigma. After the Joyita was recovered and towed back to harbor, the mystery did not fade. It evolved. Many assumed the ship would be scuttled, dismantled, or turned into a memorial of sorts. But the reality was stranger. The MV Joyita was cleaned up, patched, and eventually put back into commercial service. Yes, the ghost ship that had returned from the Pacific empty, surrounded by blood-stained clues and questions, was sold to new owners and sent out once again to sea. The decision sparked public outrage in Samoa and whispers across the Pacific. People were uneasy about sailing on her. Some port workers refused to even touch her ropes. Others claimed to see shadows moving across her deck at night. Whether these were superstitions or symptoms of collective trauma, one thing was clear. The Joyita was now more than just a ship. She was a floating myth. Her reputation only worsened over time. Every engine failure, every navigation error, every unusual weather event during her later trips was exaggerated and tied back to the original disappearance. One sailor swore he heard tapping sounds from the lower deck while anchored, despite it being sealed and empty. Another claimed to see wet footprints where no crew had walked. These stories may seem far-fetched, but they highlight the eerie legacy Joyita carried. Eventually, her operational days came to a quiet end. She was no longer profitable and no longer welcome in most ports. She was retired, stripped of most useful parts, and left to decay. For years, her hull rested in Apia, rusting under the tropical sun, a decaying monument to an unanswered question. In time, the weather and termites did what the sea could not. They broke her down. By the 1970s, she was gone, dismantled, scrapped, her wooden bones scattered. But in maritime folklore, the Joyita was far from forgotten. Writers, podcasters, and YouTubers would eventually find her again, raising her ghost in pixels and sound waves, hoping to make sense of what had happened in those silent 5 weeks at sea. What made this case especially haunting wasn't just that people disappeared. It was that the ship didn't. It came back, empty, damaged, but still afloat. It stared investigators in the face like a corpse with its eyes open, daring them to ask the question everyone feared. What if we're not supposed to know what happened? What if the MV Joyita was never meant to be explained, but remembered? The story of the MV Joyita ends much like it began, with uncertainty. Decades have passed, governments have changed, technologies have evolved, but the case remains officially unsolved. No human remains, no personal belongings recovered from the lifeboats, no survivor memoirs tucked away in some remote island shack. Just a ship found listing in the ocean, still afloat but emptied of its purpose, her lifeblood gone. And still, people ask, what really happened out there? There are moments in history where reality refuses to cooperate with logic, where evidence appears just enough to torment but not enough to resolve. The Joyita is that kind of case, too strange to forget, too broken to fix. Each theory raises more questions than it answers. If it was panic, why did trained seamen abandon a vessel that was still seaworthy? If it was piracy, why leave behind valuables and allow the ship to drift back into public view? If it was internal conflict, why no signs of struggle or distress? And if it was sabotage, who orchestrated it, and why? There's a strange poetry in the idea of a vessel drifting back from the dead. In maritime lore, a ghost ship is a symbol, a floating warning. But the Joyita was real. Her story is documented. Her ghost lives not in fantasy, but in the historical record. What chills us isn't just the horror of a crew vanishing, it's the banality of how it happened. A simple cargo run, a few hundred miles of sea, a delay, then nothing. And yet, the Joyita isn't entirely silent. She whispers through every half-torn manifest, every missing logbook, every blood-stained bandage. Her unanswered questions haunt every coast she touched. To this day, She remains a case study for maritime students and a go-to mystery for storytellers and investigators alike. She's often compared to the Mary Celeste, but unlike that famous ghost ship, the Joyita's mystery isn't centuries old. It happened in the era of radio, of radar, of search planes. That's what makes it so unsettling. We should have known, we should have found something, but we didn't. So we're left with speculation, with fragments, with what-ifs. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe some stories are meant to drift forever, untethered and unresolved. The MV Joyita didn't sink. It was returned by the sea, broken, mute, and alone. Perhaps that's all we were ever supposed to receive. The rest belongs to the deep. Note: scan the QR code to download Not.